This series is supported by Apollo Global Management, a leading provider of alternative asset management and retirement services solutions. Apollo seeks to provide clients excess return at every point along the risk-reward spectrum and is focused on empowering retirees, building and financing stronger businesses, and driving a more sustainable future.
What are the 9 most difficult words in board life or investment committee life? And it's, I don't know, I was wrong, or I've changed my mind. Or we could add another one, I need help. And I think if we can't say those words within teams, then we're just opening ourselves to all kinds of problems.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm joined today by Paul Richards, who's a decision-making expert with a particular focus on pensions and investment. He's the founder of Better Decisions and was previously head of governance and decision research at the consulting firm Redington. He previously held a series of management roles in investment firms. He's also the host of Decision Nerds podcast. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. Lovely to be here.
Well, let's start with your background. What led you to the focus then ultimately on decision-making? But we can track it on the way up to there.
Well, I think it's in my DNA. I've always had a real focus on how things work and why. I probably was and still am that person who keeps on going, yes, but why? But why? It's kind of in my DNA to try and understand things. And if I think about my career in the city, it started as an investment consultant for what is now Aon. And pretty quickly, I found myself drawn to manager research. And there I was just fascinated about trying to understand why some managers delivered and most didn't. And at around the same time in the late 90s, behavioral finance was really starting to get into the mainstream. And as a discipline, I'd always been interested in psychology, and I was absolutely drawn to behavioral finance because it was something that helped explain me to myself, and it also helped with my work. And after Aon, I moved into asset management, and I was incredibly lucky in the sense that I got to spend time with investors and strategists, looking at how they were making decisions, where they went right and where they went wrong. It was a really rich time being in the field. And I've also been lucky enough to think about things academically. And for several years at Redington, I worked with really interesting boards, helping them improve their decision making. And I think as I've reflected on this over the years, there's also a strong motivational component, not only to understand things, but to try and make things better.
I love that. Well, we certainly share the same focus on behavioral finance. And I love the fact that it started with trying to understand your own decision-making and own behaviors, because clearly that reflexive piece is a critical piece of understanding that of others, not assuming that we are ourselves not subject to the same behavioral traits, perhaps. And digging then into better decision-making, maybe why do you think it matters? What do you think happens that decisions are not made correctly or made in a rushed way? Or what is the outcome of not so optimal decision making?
Well, I guess it's an obvious point, but the decisions that we make drive everything that we do in our personal and professional lives. And the quality of our decision don't guarantee the outcomes, but they set the odds of whether we'll be happy or whether we'll meet our objectives, or maybe from a bigger picture perspective, survive and thrive as a species. And I guess I've always felt it's the tragedy of our species is that collectively and often individually, we keep on making the same mistakes. We can get better. And lots of us do. It's just one of those things, kind of like losing weight on the 1st of January. It's one of those things that's easy to say and hard to do.
And how much do you think of the focus on better decision-making is driven by the need to potentially document that decision? Because a decision could later be subject to scrutiny based on maybe the outcome of that decision being good or bad. Do you think the process is important there?
Yeah, I think process is always really important. And there's 2 different sides to this. So I've definitely worked with people or seen scenarios where people absolutely don't want things documented. And that's because it actually gives them the flexibility to change the story either to themselves or to have their reporting to. It's a self-protection mechanism, I believe. But there's really good evidence that actually having a clear process, one, will improve your decision making, But also, if you can explain to important other stakeholders why you've done what you've done, it can actually sometimes give you the incentive to make those really important but difficult to take decisions.
And what are some of the hallmarks of good decision making? Is it the introduction of a devil's advocate, a second opinion, and an interrogation of the popular opinion, maybe, or of a consensus view? Is it a pre-mortem? We heard about the post-mortems and pre-mortem. You're thinking about what might go wrong. Any areas where you think obvious improvements can be made?
Yeah, I mean, all of those things that you've mentioned have some really good, robust evidence around why they can actually add some value. Now, interestingly, when I speak to people about things, I don't tend to start there. The first and most important thing I always start with is context. Because if we look at the broad landscape of history, there has been a lot of focus on decision making. We now tend to know why we make mistakes. There's strands of research and people's practical experience about how we can actually make it better. The thing is, it's whether we can actually do it or not. And so I know you've served on boards of pension funds. You've also worked in investment teams. These are very different organizations. And often one of the things that we tend to do as humans is generalize. We want a one size fits all rule. So to me, the most important thing that people get wrong in trying to improve decisions is not thinking about the context. Have I got a group of experts around the table who have the time and ability and the common language to think about a complex solution that they can actually use? Or have I got a really well-meaning group of people who perhaps don't understand a lot of the technical details? The solution for one will be very different to the other, but often people will just, as we do as humans, pick up something they've seen in Harvard Business Review. It sounds really plausible and let's bring it in. And sometimes it will help. Not thinking about the context can often be the worst mistake you can make in your decision making.
And how have you find it optimal to deal with conflict in there? Do you encourage healthy conflict based on ideas, obviously not people? Do you encourage, maybe once a decision has been made, the previous naysayers to commit nonetheless to that decision, even if they were not perhaps in favor of it?
Well, again, it's $1 million question. It really does depend on what kind of group you have in front of you. I think one of the things that in a well-functioning investment management firm, you have to have ability for people to be able to live with decisions that can go wrong. But again, you will know from your investment career there were some people who will sort of die on a hill trying to reframe past errors. So probably the most important thing is figuring out what will actually work for a group. Again, I know you've raised many children. I actually spent a lot of time raising my children when they were young, and I could never get my children to eat vegetables. This is probably something that will resonate with many of your audience members. And so with my wife, the way that we figured out to deal with it in the end is that we just chopped them up extremely small, got it in a spaghetti bolognese. We couldn't have had a rational debate with them about why vegetables were good for them. We just actually built it into the process. And when I think about the work that I do with boards or teams, the first question I always ask myself is this a group of people who really want to actually understand their behavior? And we can have that really sensible discussion, think about what biases are, name and tame the behavior, or actually, is this a group that can't deal with conflict? And therefore, you've got to actually figure out a strategy that will work for them and that they can live with. Again, your audience is probably going to get really bored with me bringing up the concept of context, but it's the most under talked about thing, I think, in decision making.
Well, no, it's a really interesting kind of refutation of the concept that one size fits all. And I think probably we don't give enough attention to actually our circumstance and the composition of a board. I'd love to segue there to a little bit of the work you do at Better Decisions, because you founded this firm focused on working in a consultation way to get better decisions achieved at committee level. Can you speak about the work you do there and the type of where you come into the process and what the type of work would be?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. There's probably two strands to the work that I do. One where actually you're trying to figure out something after you're trying to shut the door after the horse has actually bolted, and you're kind of dealing with people with quite raw emotions, and you're trying to make sense of things and put things forward. And there it's really, again, context-led about firstly not being blamey or judgmental, even if perhaps people who are actually creating the project want a bit of that to actually happen. it's a basic rule of, I guess, of humans that if you're going to be put under the spotlight and someone's going to say you did this wrong, people just immediately start to close in. So creating a really open environment where we can talk about stuff is really important. And then again, depending on the nature of the group, think about how we can fix it for the future. The other side of it, which is there's far fewer of them, but it's far more enjoyable work, is when you've got really thoughtful groups. And I think we tend to see this more in the investment management sphere often than in the board, who recognize that good decision making, it's the absolute heart of what they do. And therefore, just like anything else, we should be coached on it. We should be thinking about how we're going to get better. Because if we don't, if we just rely on what worked yesterday, then someone's going to probably eat our lunch. So the way that I work, it's trying to teach people to solve the problems themselves. The classic, and I don't want to name one firm, but let's pick a big one like McKinsey will be, I just want to make you kind of rely on me for this project that will go on and on and on. I'm far more interested in coming in and helping teach people to think for themselves and solve their own problems.
We're going to take a short break to hear from the supporter of this series, Apollo Global Management. I sat down with Joe Moran, Managing Director, Institutional RIA Sales at Apollo. I asked Joe what opportunities Apollo was seeing in the private wealth segment.
So Apollo is developing a product suite that solves fundamental retirement and investment needs and is tailored specifically for the individual. Individual investors remain significantly underweight alternatives relative to institutions, and Apollo is committed to being an innovator in the industry, applying the firm's more than 30 years of problem solving for the world's largest institutions to the wealth channel.
And now, back to the show. Really interesting. I suppose I'd love to know how much time is spent dissecting past decisions and more others just setting the framework for future decisions. Because what I've found is in the fast-paced world of business and investment, there's often desire not to look backwards, but only to look forwards. And there's certainly plenty on everyone's plate to do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting phenomenon. And again, it really depends, I think, where you're starting from this. If you're starting from a point of success, then I think people are often far happier to look back into that rosy sunset and say, hey, this is what we did well. I think if things have gone wrong, then it's a harder thing to do. But again, from my perspective, if I'm working about this, or if you have any CIOs or consultants listening, I think the key point is that you're trying to look for patterns of behavior rather than the individual thing. So rather than dragging someone over the coals and said, yes, 1 month you were 5% down, at 3 months that, it's trying to get people to talk about whether there was anything systematic that's going on. But it is a very difficult line to actually walk. I think I've learned in my career that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So from my perspective, there would actually be some people who I would just say, after initial discussion, maybe I'm not going to work for you. In the recent podcast, we spoke to Professor Paul Goodwin, who's an expert in the world of forecasting, and he talked about a particular case study with an ex-colleague that he'd actually done. It was of a company that was in a difficult strategic position, and essentially all paths looked difficult, but they went in to start this project and it went horribly wrong because of CEO interference in the project. It was a classic case study of how not to do this type of thing. But what was interesting to me about this was that when they wrote the paper, they said in the first meeting, they sat down with the CEO. The CEO said to them, I've positioned mirrors here and here in my office. Do you know why? And they said, no. And he said, it's because when people come in and they won't engage with eye contact in me when I'm trying to get something done, they can't look away. They can't avoid the gaze. So no matter where they looked, because of the position of these mirrors, they could stare through. Now, for me, I would just be, really interesting chat, but I don't think I can help you. Luckily for us, the academics didn't, because that paper is filled with really interesting insights about where things can go wrong on a strategic planning exercise.
Well, we'll definitely link to that paper in the show notes, as well as to your podcast, which is a great lead in to discussing that. So you launched Decision Nerds podcast. Let's talk a little bit about that, what your goal is with that. And can you mention some of the discussions you've enjoyed the most?
Sure. So maybe just some background. I run Decision Nerds with Joe Wiggins. Joe is the head of investment research at SJP, one of the biggest wealth managers, or the biggest wealth manager in the UK. And I'd known him for several years. He was, in fact, the first guest at a regular decision-making event that I did at Redington. He's a lovely guy, very thoughtful. And I would say to any of your audience, he's definitely worth a follow on LinkedIn. He writes some really great stuff. And as the podcast is quite accurately named, we are both nerds. And in 2023, we could admit that. Probably when we were at school, we couldn't because it would have got us beaten up. But we both share an obsession with understanding behavior and how we can make people do better choices. We are nowhere as prolific as you, but we have finished our first season and we've had a ton of interesting discussions. I think two that would be interesting for anyone who's listening. One with Claire Finn-Levy, who's the founder and CEO of Essentia Analytics. That was on helping people understand themselves and change. And the second one was with WCM on culture. Essentia are a really interesting business in that they have a tech platform that helps people understand the biases in their decision making. And you could do a whole podcast on how tech can help people make better decisions. But the really interesting point about it is that when they produce all these insights, they have to give them to portfolio managers. The portfolio managers have to look at them, accept them, to actually start that process of change. So it was a fascinating discussion for both of us because all three of us have been involved in this type of thing over the years of just triangulating what works when you're trying to get people to change and what doesn't. The second one was with WCM. And for anyone in your audience who doesn't know them, WCM, a US-based investment manager, an equity investment manager. And one of their key competitive advantages is that they try and understand companies' culture. And they look for companies with a strong culture and an expanding economic moat. So it was fascinating to talk to them because they've really got skin in the game. Culture is one of those things that we can all talk about because we've all experienced it, but they've really been in the trenches thinking about what predicts future performance. And there are probably three key things that I think we should take away from that. And the first and most important one is leadership matters. There's no point in having cultural principles if leaders don't follow them. People look at what leaders do, not what is on the PowerPoint. And incidentally, the subtitle of that podcast is The Perils of PowerPoint, which is, I think, where we often go wrong with culture. The second one, again, was this issue of context. For them, interestingly, when they were talking about and reflecting on it in the podcast, when they started looking at firms' cultures, they actually started by thinking about what had worked for them and looking for seeds of that in other businesses. But then they just said, no, that can't be right. We're trying to do one particular type of thing. This is one, the breadth of that culture, how deeply it's understood, not just by the person, the CEO, but by every person around the organization. And secondly, this concept of cultural intensity, how strongly the culture is actually lived.
Absolutely fascinating. And I do know WCM, and I know they themselves have quite a distinct culture there in their California hub, which I think is definitely encourages lifestyle integration with the workforce. And everybody seems to be working quite happily within that culture. On the intensity point, how does that get conveyed? I mean, we've spoken before in this podcast about communication and how many times a concept or idea has to be communicated before it sinks in. And I think it's close to 7. So definitely repetition is one way of conveying an idea. We've seen it pop up on walls and on screensavers. And really, it's just ubiquitous. This mission, this company reinforced subconsciously and consciously. How do you achieve that intensity?
So again, it's not something that I've deeply researched. I used to think about this when I was an investment manager, researcher, and as a senior manager, it's something that I've thought about when I've seen things go right or wrong. To me, it's this point about authenticity and really living it. I think everyone, and I mean everyone who's listening to this podcast, will have seen examples where they've had the PowerPoint or watch the video from the senior leader and then seen someone at the next management layer down not doing what the senior leader says, this is what we're actually all about. So to me, it's about people living and breathing it. And crucially, culture's easy when you're having to make easy decisions. It's always easy to be supportive and positive with colleagues when things are going right. It's learning to do that when the chips are down and difficult. I think that's almost where you need the management intervention and to remind people that this is what we're actually about. But it's in any organization, there's a specific phrase for it, culture carriers. it's really important for those people to do things consistently and for it to be seen to be rewarded. So again, one of the things that I know every organization will have struggled with at times is where you have exceptionally good people, perhaps portfolio managers, who are great portfolio managers, but should never be let anywhere near management or leadership roles.
Well, let's talk about asset management firms in particular and their culture, because certainly culture at a broader level seems to be getting more and more attention. We've heard the whole, culture eats strategy for breakfast and any number of variations on that theme. But within asset managers itself, with the exception maybe of the Bridgewater and Ray Dalio's principles, we don't hear a lot about it and it doesn't get a lot of attention. And clearly with the amount of money being managed and returns at stake, it is quite critical that, it gets some attention, I would suggest. What is the importance of culture within asset managers? And do you think it gets the attention it deserves?
So firstly, let's think about the importance of it. Again, going back to the early 80s, there was seminal shifts in work, whether that came from Tom Peters or Peter Drucker, that said, actually, companies with strong cultures do tend to perform better. And I think everyone is partly interested in it, but there are some real issues with culture. I think the first one is it's so intangible. It's one of those interesting things that's like God or love. We think we know what it is until you actually have to define it crisply. And then if you actually start to try and do that, you can just see how tough it is. And you look in the research literature, whether that's management or anthropology, there's this huge range of definitions of what culture is. So the first point is that we don't really know often what we're talking about. The second point that's related to that is it makes it difficult to measure. Investment management firms are very process oriented. For example, at Redington, every month we would have done a quick, how are you feeling on things? Did that accurately capture culture? I don't know. Interestingly, we talked about WCM. The way that they do it is actually sort of having a band of people whose job it is to actually take the temperature regularly and then actually sit down with the CEO. And the advantage of that is that you're getting multiple endpoints from people who actually have a view on these things. But the people have been selected to actually be able to say the difficult things if needs be. One of the challenges, I think, of measuring culture, or one of the reasons perhaps people don't want to do it, is I think leadership can often want just positive things from it, that everything's great, it's all going fine. And reality, that isn't the case. I mean, you mentioned Bridgewater. If you look on Glassdoor at any given point in time, there's lots of people who will have a view that maybe the culture isn't, as is often said on either whether Ray Dalio's YouTube channel or whatever. It's just the reality of getting people together. I think, again, this key point of leadership is that we can change culture. This is the other point of it. No culture is perfect, but we all know it's difficult to change ourselves. Getting a whole group of people to actually change can actually be even more difficult. And one of the problems about this is, and again, I think it's a broader governance problem, is that people try and do too much in one go. So you've been on boards, Aoife, you've no doubt been through governance exercises where you try and do everything within a 2-day period, and it's just too difficult to actually do. One of the very practical things that I try and do where I'm working with an investment team or boards is to think about what's most important, and let's actually figure that out first in a way that you can actually do straight away, rather than having this great strategic vision that requires a huge amount of work to get done and maybe not everyone will immediately buy into.
So keeping things bite-sized, manageable, and maybe getting points on the board by actually achieving some of these milestones in a concrete way before taking on too much. Very interesting. I'd love to come back to a point you mentioned about when it's when things go wrong that culture really gets tested. Because we have in the asset management industry plenty of examples of things going wrong, whether it be investments that go awry or wholesale, maybe asset outflows, or we have PR trip-ups. And I was particularly interested in something conveyed by Jack Dorsey to somebody who left Square around owning mistakes early and openly and getting ahead essentially of anybody else. So that one thing can be said that you're not maybe trying to cover up things. I thought that was an interesting way to approach bad news. Any area you think is an example of maybe how you can deal with those setbacks in a way that reinforces the culture and that are emblematic of a good culture?
there's so many things that you can do. But interestingly, I'll use an example from Goldman Sachs, where I worked for many years. Now, Goldman has a whole number of business principles that people look at when they join the organization. But the interesting point to me, when I joined in 2002, I had to go through 3 separate processes where I sat down with other people joining the firm at the same point in time. And the really interesting point that's kind of related to your Jack Dorsey thing was the only thing that I can remember that came out from all of those 3 things was that people said, and it was a very consistent message, whether you join as an analyst, an MD, or a partner, if something goes wrong and you don't circulate that with other people, you try and manage your way out of this yourself. Doesn't matter whether you're an analyst or a partner, then you will have no future with the firm. So forget all the other things about how we kind of treat clients. To me, that was a really interesting point. And I mention this to lots of people because if every organization followed that rule, many of the mistakes that could be captured when we make decisions that are small, we could actually manage. The key thing is, and this is where it's a fine line to balance, because we want people to own their decisions. We want them to be proactive, but sometimes actually doing that and not involving other people can just take a small, easily manageable problem into something that can be impossible to actually manage. But if we think about it more broadly, again, if we think about what investment managers have to do, if we think about the context, if we boiled it all down, it's taking decisions under uncertainty where we're going to be wrong most of the time. And that's very difficult for people to actually deal with. And I know we both share a strong interest in psychological safety. And I think when I do sessions with boards on psychological safety, I often start by asking them to think about what are the 9 most difficult words in board life or investment committee life. And it's, I don't know, I was wrong, or I've changed my mind. Or we could add another one, I need help. And I think if we can't say those words within teams, then we're just opening ourselves to all kinds of problems. So again, when I've spoken to a couple of CIOs recently about issues related to this, about tribalism in investment decision-making, or when people end up in an I am right, you are wrong argument. If we could just get past that and say, okay, well, maybe the world has actually changed, then we might be able to exit positions more quickly. We might be able to move into new ones. But I think there's an interesting sea change in culture. I joined the industry back in the mid-90s. And even then, working for the research department for a consulting firm, the culture was one of very much, you have to fight for your ideas. You have to fight to actually be listened to. And I think within the industry, there was pretty strong Darwinian selection for the ability to do that. Not only did you have to be right, but you actually had to have that attitude. And what that's probably meant in practice is that actually there's been some terrific decision makers who don't fit that mold that the industry has actually missed out on. And one of the things that I think that we're seeing with the broader DEI movement is, as we try and recruit different types of people, perhaps people who don't actually fit that mold, we're in this really interesting cultural turning point where we've still got people at the senior end who've grown up in that environment, maybe not relating to how people who are coming in at the analyst class, to their expectations and how they feel, which is, it's great for me because it's an interesting talking point to help bring those two things together. But it's a structural point that I haven't seen people talk about in the industry that I think is really important. Just these two different groups of people, and how do we make it work for both of them?
So interesting. And it echoes something that Brian Portnoy, who studies behavioral finance in private wealth arenas primarily, speaks about the kind of evolution of our behavioral templates from Wolf of Wall Street to Brene Brown. And a lot of what you convey there, so all those statements you said are hallmarks perhaps of good culture. I don't know, I need help, even I'm sorry, I'll throw in there, are all hallmarks of vulnerability. And clearly vulnerability is one of those strange emotions that there almost is an element of game theory about it. And the sense that it's hard for people at certain status to show vulnerability if it's not been shown more broadly, because then it's only them that's evincing it, and then they will be perceived as weak. Whereas if it's been evinced by somebody at a more senior level, perhaps with more, I suppose, clout, I should say, if we can use that term, then I think it can be more of a kind of an example then for the rest of an organization. But clearly that vulnerability is a key part of being ready to change. I wanted to link this then to a discussion around authenticity, because this, again, in the D&I movement gets a lot of attention, bringing one's whole self to work, which can be good to a point. But I think there could also be an element where in a culture where we want to get on with people, and we also hear about no jerks policies, etc. Would you believe in that unbridled authenticity, bringing one's whole self to work? Do you believe that is something that needs to be done with guardrails?
I think a lot of change, if we're honest, starting slow and using guardrails is potentially a valuable thing to do when we don't know what the answer actually is going to be into anything. And again, there's an old adage of this, the critic G.K. Chesterton, there's a thing associated with him called Chesterton's fence. I don't know if you've come across this before. No, so the whole idea behind it is, and we particularly see it within the context of social movements where there's disparate views about this, that people will come along and with an idea and say, we should just bring our whole selves to work. And that may or may not be a good idea. But if we think, Chesterton's point was, if we think about this as a fence, then before you take that fence down, you need to understand why it was there in the first place and really clearly articulate the value of taking it down. And often, it's not just to do with issues like this, that often that there will be overconfident people within our industry who will just say, we should go into product area X or geography Y, without maybe thinking, why haven't we done this before? Do we have the capability to do it? So bringing it back to the particular point about bringing your whole self to work, it's a really difficult one. Again, it would depend if you're in a small company, a large company, but people are different. And I know you spend a lot of your time in the US, which is currently one of the most polarized, if not the most polarized country in the world. Encouraging people to actually do that just has the ability to take away a massive amount of effectiveness as people end up othering each other, seeing them as people who they can't actually work with. And there are some companies, some smaller tech companies now who've just had a very clear rule of saying, no politics at work. We're here to do the work, not get embroiled in all the craziness that's going on outside. So there's another side to that of just not making people feel they have to be straitjacketed. But I think, again, doing it thoughtfully rather than just making this random statement, so not a random statement, but making a statement without saying, what does that actually mean in practice is a really important thing.
Well, we could talk, I think, on a series of podcasts about culture. There's so many rich avenues to explore here, and it's been a wonderful, eye-opening experience thus far. I just want to conclude with some personal reflections, at least for this podcast. We can maybe think about the next one going forward. Look, you've mentioned a number of key people already, people you've learned from, people you've worked with. Any few that you can mention perhaps that were mentors throughout your career journey?
I've been lucky enough to work with lots and lots of fantastic people. Sometimes I've learned positive things from them. Sometimes I've watched people do things horrendously, and that's been as valuable as well. So I think one of the things for me is that, firstly, I don't tend to lionize people. This really annoys my wife, by the way, because she will perhaps want a singular view of individual people. And I think as people, we're all very complex. We're all made up of good and bad parts. You, me, everyone out there. And so rather than either lionizing or demonizing people, then there's lots of people that I've learned small things from. What I've always tried to do is look at the bigger picture. So the most consequential decision that I've made in my career was back in 2007. I decided to take time out to raise my daughters, support my wife back into her role, and actually do some academic work around decision making. And one of the reasons that I actually did that was just not from one particular person, but just seeing time and time and time again, men, and this maybe you're a very successful career woman, it may be there, people getting towards the end of their career and not knowing their children. And I think this is probably particularly true in perhaps a culture like Goldman that really, really gives you the opportunity to do so much in a work environment. So looking at all of that evidence in aggregate and taking the time to raise my children is something that I don't regret. Perhaps occasionally when I look at my pension plan and and our net worth, it would have been a very different story if I'd stayed at Goldman. But I've had that real kind of valuable thing of raising my children, which I should say, if I ever went back to work in an investment bank, dealing with very small children would give me an amazing management advantage that I never had before.
I love that. Focusing on the people, because I think every single podcast I've listened to and I've hosted, it does always come back to people and networks and understanding them. So I love that, focusing on the people closest to you. How about any piece of advice? So we've already had a number of great sound bites in here from culture carriers that you've interacted with, but any kind of creed or motto that you live by, or a piece of advice that really stuck with you?
Well, okay, let's do one from first. Let's start with probably the father of Western philosophy, Socrates. Now, Socrates is interesting. He created so many interesting debates, methods, discussions, but was actually forced to commit suicide by, the Greek government at the time, because his awkward questions really, they felt, were dragging society in the wrong way. And in his trial, one of the things that Plato records him saying is the unexamined life is not worth living. Now, that's a pretty strong point to make. But I know from my own perspective, if I just want to understand how the world works, if I don't understand why I'm doing something or why I'm behaving in a certain way, I'm just doomed to keep repeating it. And we'll go from the sublime to the ridiculous, and we'll finish with some advice from a taxi driver called Brian. Now, again, I'm sure all your listeners who've been here have had Uber drivers or taxi drivers or loads of them over the years. And certainly my experience is that you can put them maybe into two broad camps. The first one are those slightly scary people who just stare straight ahead and don't say anything at all through the whole journey. But the other one are the talkers. There are people who just want to talk to you all the time. And I remember coming back from a conference several years ago, slightly jaded. I'd been up late the night before, and the taxi driver started off by saying, "Oh, what do you do?" And I explained, and normally this just sends people to sleep when I explain to them the work that I do around decision making. But he was instantly set alight by this, and he said, "Oh, I must just tell you a story about my son." And it turned out, taxi driver Brian, his son had a bit of a run-in with the law the night before. And Brian sat him down and said to him, "Okay, there's three types of people in this world, and you've got to figure out what you want to be." And he said the first thing he said to them was, stupid people, they don't learn from their mistakes. Smart people, they do learn from their mistakes. But really smart people learn from other people's mistakes. What do you want to be? And I was like instantly awake thinking, oh my God, have I found the Socrates of taxi drivers? And we reach peak wisdom in that statement. But I think we should all try and be a bit more Brian and not just learn from our own mistakes, but learn from others as well.
Brilliant. Well, I can't think of a better way to end this discussion than reflecting on how much discussion of others' behavior, mistakes is actually such fodder for our own lives. And thank you so much, Paul, for being that decision nerd that you profess to be, because if it wasn't for that, we wouldn't have this incredibly rich tapestry of ideas, learning, and takeaways around culture. So thank you for coming here and just scratching the surface of what lies beneath with us.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organizations and affiliations of the host or any guest.